He received a call at 6:45 in the morning. The call came from an office number he recognized, the Supreme National Security Council's Administrative Division. The voice on the line was professional and brief. He was asked to be present at 7 o'clock in the building on Pasteur Street, the third-floor conference room, not the main briefing suite. He noted the difference without commenting on it. He dressed in his advisory uniform, not exactly military, but not civilian either. It was the specific gray that marked the space between those two worlds, which his position had always occupied. He pressed it the way he pressed everything, completely, without shortcuts. He was out the door at 6:52 and in the building at 6:58, as he always arrived 2 minutes early. Punctuality was the first discipline and the last one that left you. The man waiting for him in the third-floor conference room was named Hosseini. He was the Supreme Leader's new chief of staff, 43 years old, Rashidian's man from before Rashidian became Supreme Leader. He carried the particular energy of someone who had recently gained authority he had long desired, and was still figuring out how to handle it. He stood when Ryan entered and gestured to a chair, but did not offer tea. The absence of tea in this city and culture said everything about what the next 11 minutes would hold. Hosseini spoke for about 4 of those 11 minutes. He used terms like restructuring, realignment, and transition period, as well as the specific phrase the new leadership's vision for a unified advisory framework. Such sentences were crafted to sound important while conveying no real meaning. The advisory council position Ryan had held for 6 years was being eliminated. The new leadership valued his service, and they requested his resignation effective immediately. He would receive his full entitlements. There was a document. Ryan listened without interrupting. He had a habit of listening fully, not the kind of listening where you wait for your turn to speak, but the actual kind where you absorb what is said and what is meant and the gap between those two things. You file it all away before responding. This habit had made him exceptional at his work, but it didn't help him practically at that moment. He did it anyway because it was who he was. When Hosseini finished, Ryan asked one question. "Is there a written order?" There was. Hosseini slid it across the table. Ryan read it thoroughly, every paragraph, every clause, and the signature at the bottom. It was Rashidian's seal but not his hand, indicating the Supreme Leader had authorized the dismissal but did not want to write it himself. Another distinction worth noting. He signed the acknowledgement, stood up, and shook Hosseini's hand firmly and professionally. It was the way a man shakes hands with someone he won't pretend to respect, but also won't disrespect. He picked up the document and walked out. The hallway was empty. The elevator was empty. The lobby held 2 guards who had seen him enter this building for 6 years. They watched him leave without expression. It was not their place to react, and they were professional men. Some of what they felt had no safe outlet. He walked onto Pasteur Street into the Tehran morning. The city was doing what Tehran does at 7:11 in the morning, organized chaos as the capital woke up. Traffic already built on the expressways. The call to prayer from the nearest mosque had ended 20 minutes earlier. The smell of bread from the corner bakery, which had been there since before he was born, filled the air. He had walked this street hundreds of times. Now, he stood there for a moment to feel the full weight of what had just happened. 11 minutes. 6 years of work. 30 years of building expertise so precise and complete that 2 governments on opposite sides of the world had found it indispensable, reduced to 11 minutes of careful administration and a document with someone else's seal. He allowed himself that moment, then walked to his car. He drove home and called his mother. Lorraine Caldwell was 67 years old and lived in Silver Spring, Maryland. She had spent her life navigating the dual identity of a Black American woman married to an Iranian man, in a country that found both facts alternately interesting and inconvenient. She raised her son between 2 cities, 2 cultures, 2 languages, and 2 versions of what a man like him was supposed to be. She did it with steady, quiet love, understanding that the most important thing she could give her child was the absolute certainty that he was who he was supposed to be, regardless of what any institution in any country declared. She picked up on the second ring. "Talk to me," she said. She always said that. Not hello. Not how are you. Talk to me. The invitation her son had been accepting since he was old enough to need to say things. He told her. Not everything. He never shared all details, not due to distrust, but because some professional burdens could not be shared in civilian conversations without changing their weight. But he conveyed the gist. The meeting. The 11 minutes. The document. She was quiet for a moment, then replied, "Come home, baby." "Not yet," he said. Another pause. He could hear her breathing, and behind that, the sounds of Silver Spring on a Tuesday morning, ordinary and far from the Tehran street where he was parked. "All right," she said. "Then do what you do. You know what you are. They don't get to change that with a piece of paper." He said, "I know, Mama." He ended the call, sat in his car for 3 minutes watching the city, then went upstairs to his apartment. He changed into civilian clothes, made coffee, sat down at his desk, and opened his laptop. He had work to do. He always had work to do. That had not changed because someone decided they no longer wanted it. To understand what Ryan Caldwell built over 30 years, you needed to grasp the particular improbability of his existence, not as a hardship, but as a design. He was the product of two opposing worlds. His father left Tehran for Washington in 1979 with an engineering degree and a belief that knowledge has no nationality. His mother recognized something familiar in that belief. Adele Caldwell, his father's chosen American surname, taken from the street in Alexandria where they lived during their first year in America, was a structural engineer of considerable distinction. He built bridges in 3 countries and raised his son on the conviction that the most important structures are those that hold under pressure. The test of any design is not its appearance in drawings, but how it performs when the load is real. Ryan absorbed this completely. He applied it not to bridges but to conflict, to military strategies, to the load-bearing elements of geopolitical decisions, to how nations position themselves under the pressure of competing interests, and what makes those positions hold or fail. He studied this at 2 war colleges and in the field, learning by being present in rooms where significant decisions were made and paying attention that produced understanding rather than just observation. By 35, he was the most sought-after strategic mind in a very small and serious world. By 40, he had twice turned down positions in the United States intelligence community, not due to a lack of patriotism, but because the work he could do between the 2 countries was more valuable than anything he could achieve entirely within either one. He accepted the position in Tehran at the age of 41. He negotiated the terms directly with the chief of staff of the previous supreme leader. After 6 years, he had made himself so essential to Iran's strategic security that no one seriously considered removing him. That was until RESIGN came into the picture. RESIGN was a different kind of player. He had risen through the clerical ranks at a time when loyalty mattered more than effectiveness. He reached supreme leadership believing, sincerely and dangerously, that loyalty outweighed competence and that the two could be seen as separate. When he looked at Ryan Caldwell, he saw someone whose loyalty he couldn't claim. Iranian by birth, American by citizenship, black by blood, and trusted by both sides while fully belonging to neither. RESIGN decided, as men like him often do, what cannot be owned must be eliminated. The dismissal took just 11 minutes. What RESIGN didn't realize, and what he hadn't paid close enough attention to in the 6 weeks since he took charge, was what those 11 minutes had just cost him. He would find out at 6:17 that evening. They called it a restructuring, gave it 11 minutes, handed him a document, and showed him the door. If you've ever been let go from something you built by someone who didn't understand its value, stay with us. This story is about what happens next. Like the video, subscribe to Golden Triumphant Stories and turn on notifications. We're just getting started. Ryan worked for 4 hours after being dismissed. He didn't work frantically or with a rushed energy, trying to escape what had happened. Instead, he worked as he always did, methodically and thoroughly, with the focus that had marked his professional life from the beginning. He updated his strategic threat assessment, the living document he had maintained for 6 years, containing his analysis of every significant military risk facing Iran across 12 active threat vectors. He updated it weekly, cross-referencing intelligence from both sides of his dual existence. He wasn't doing this in an official capacity. He had resigned from that role 3 hours earlier. He was working because it was his job and discipline, and because the document was his to complete. He couldn't leave important work unfinished. He also worked because he understood, having spent 30 years learning how systems fail, that the dismissal had created a vulnerability. Not immediately, not visibly, but like removing a load-bearing element from a structure, which creates vulnerability that isn't apparent until the strain arrives. That strain was already on its way. He identified it 14 months earlier. Under Threat Vector 7 in his assessment, he noted a potential cyberattack pathway through Iran's integrated air defense network, exploiting a legacy authentication protocol in the northwestern corridor's secondary communication layer. This vulnerability arose from a 2019 network expansion that used components from 3 different vendors with incompatible authentication standards, leading to a gap that a sophisticated attacker could use. He documented it with the precision he applied to everything: the technical details of the vulnerability, the likely attack method, the window during which it could be exploited, and a specific recommendation for defensive restructuring to close it. He presented this to the Security Council in February of the previous year. The military's technical division reviewed it, partially accepted it, and then deprioritized it during the transition after the previous Supreme Leader's death. While the partial implementation addressed 2 of the 4 vulnerabilities he identified, the other 2 remained open. This fact weighed heavily on Ryan since the meeting that morning. Not because he wanted to be right. He never wished to be right about threat assessments. Being right meant the threat was real, which put people in danger, the very reason for his work. He had spent 14 months hoping to be wrong. He updated the document and noted the dismissal date in the version log, as he was meticulous about version logs. For him, thoroughness was non-negotiable. He was Ryan Caldwell, and he completed his tasks even when the institution that once valued that completeness decided it no longer did. He closed his laptop at 12:30, made lunch, and ate while standing by his kitchen window. He looked out at the Tehran afternoon, where the light did what it does in November, low, golden, and illuminating the city's angles into something almost lovely. He considered calling General Tehrani, the highest-ranking military commander in Iran's armed forces, who understood the significance of Ryan's work. But Tehrani was also careful about institutional loyalty, and a call from a dismissed advisor to a serving general just hours after the dismissal could jeopardize the general's position. He decided to wait. He didn't have to wait long. His phone rang at 6:17 that evening. The number was blocked, a Tehran area code he didn't recognize. He answered. The voice on the line was silent for 2 seconds. Then it spoke in Farsi, steady and precise, reflecting a career built on careful word choice. There is a technical question I believe you can help clarify. In your role as a private citizen and former advisor, if you could provide some technical guidance, it would be appreciated. Ryan recognized the voice immediately. He had heard it in briefing rooms and field operations for 6 years. He didn't say General Tehrani's name during the call, and neither did the general. Ryan asked 2 questions and gathered enough information to understand the situation: the network breach, the northwestern corridor, and the technical team working on the issue without the assessment they needed. He did not say, "I told you this would happen." He did not say, "14 months ago, I wrote a document that predicted this very scenario." He did not say, "The entry point is in the Legacy Authentication Protocol, Appendix 4, page 37, which someone ought to have read." Instead, he said, "Send me the network topology. Give me 2 hours." After a pause, the general replied, "It will be sent in 10 minutes. The call ended. Ryan set down his phone and looked out at the evening in Tehran. The city was fully dark, the skyline lights flickering on, offering the unique beauty of a city at night that doesn't realize it is being protected. He opened his laptop. He was dismissed at 7:11 in the morning. By 6:17 in the evening, they needed him. Not the institution, not Rashidian, not the paperwork, but him specifically and irreplaceably. Have you ever been released by someone who didn't know what they were letting go? Share your story in the comments. If Golden Triumphant resonates with you, subscribe immediately. This story is headed somewhere extraordinary. The network topology arrived in 11 minutes. It was a compressed, encrypted file, technical and detailed, containing the full architectural map of Iran's integrated air defense communication network in the northwestern corridor. For most people, it would have been hard to understand. In Ryan's hands, it felt familiar. He had reviewed versions of this topology for 6 years. He knew its structure as well as a surgeon knows anatomy, not as a simple diagram, but as lived knowledge, the specific interactions between each system, how the load shifted, concentrated, and where, under pressure, it might fail. He opened it and began to read. The attack was already inside, not an active strike, but a positioning. It was like a foreign body entering an organism, finding its place before starting its work. The penetration had occurred through exactly the pathway Ryan had documented. The legacy authentication protocol in the secondary communication layer, where the 2019 infrastructure expansion had left the handshake gap. The actor, and Ryan could identify the methodology's signature from the movement pattern, the particular style of a state-sponsored team he had tracked for 3 years, had found the gap and was now navigating the network interior with the careful patience of someone who had planned this approach for a long time. He found the entry point in 38 minutes. It was in Appendix 4 of his February assessment, page 37, exactly as documented, exactly as predicted. The legacy protocol in the Tabriz node's secondary authentication layer. The gap was 312 characters wide in the handshake sequence, enough for a sophisticated intrusion to pass through without triggering the primary detection system, which was monitoring for a different attack profile. He sat back for a moment. He looked at the ceiling of his apartment. He allowed himself exactly one breath of the particular feeling that arrives when you have been right about something you desperately wanted to be wrong about. Then he went back to work. The fix was not simple. A simple patch would close the Tabriz node gap, but leave the underlying protocol vulnerability intact, addressable again from a different entry point by the same actor within weeks. What was needed was a structural correction, a reconfiguration of the authentication handshake sequence across all 3 non-compatible vendor systems, implemented in a specific order that would not disrupt the active defense network while the correction was being applied. He designed it from first principles, not from memory, though his memory of the system was essentially complete, but from the topology in front of him, working the problem as it currently existed rather than as he had previously assessed it. Because situations change and solutions that were correct 6 months ago may be incomplete today, and he had not survived 30 years of strategic work by assuming that yesterday's answers were sufficient for today's problems. He worked with the focused, total absorption of a man who has found the thing he was built for and is doing it completely. The Tehran night deepened outside his window. The city went about its life, oblivious, ordinary, trusting that the systems designed to protect it were functioning, not knowing that those systems were currently compromised, and that the man most qualified to fix the compromise was doing so from a civilian apartment in his street clothes, no longer officially employed by anyone. He designed 3 components of the fix sequentially. The primary authentication correction for the Tabriz node, the secondary protocol update for the Isfahan relay, the tertiary handshake reconfiguration for the full northwestern corridor that would close not only the current vulnerability, but 2 adjacent ones that the attacking actor had not yet identified, but would given enough time. He documented everything. Not just the fix, the methodology, the reasoning, the sequence of implementation, the monitoring parameters that would confirm successful application. He wrote it the way he wrote everything, completely, clearly, with enough detail that a competent technical team could implement it without him. Because he understood that the most important solutions were the ones that did not require the person who designed them to be present for their execution. That the mark of genuine expertise was not indispensability but transferability, the ability to build knowledge that outlasted your presence in any specific room. He finished at 9:41 in the evening, 3 hours and 24 minutes after receiving the topology. He reviewed everything once. He encrypted the document. He sent it to the number that had sent him the topology. He closed his laptop. He stood up. He stretched, the physical release of a body that has been still for 3 hours in complete concentration, the muscles remembering they exist. He went to his kitchen. He made tea, the particular tea his father had taught him, the Iranian blend that his mother had learned to love, and that Ryan had drunk every evening of his adult life as the one ritual that was entirely his own, that belonged to no institution and no government and no professional obligation. He drank it standing at his window. Somewhere in the northwestern corridor, a technical team was receiving his document. Somewhere in a server room, an authentication protocol was being corrected. Somewhere in the digital infrastructure of a foreign intelligence operation, a pathway that had been carefully opened was being quietly, permanently closed. He did not know any of this for certain. He would not know it for certain until Tehrani called again. But he knew it the way he knew most things, with the quiet conviction of someone who had built something that worked and had learned to trust his own construction. He finished his tea. He washed the cup. He went to bed. He slept better than he had in 6 weeks. 3 hours. No official capacity. No uniform. No title. Just the work. The 30 years of accumulated knowledge that a piece of paper could not resign, that a restructuring could not reorganize, that 11 minutes in a conference room could not touch. That is what excellence actually is. Not a position, not a rank, a thing you carry. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded of that right now. General Tehrani called at 6:53 the following morning. The fix had worked. The technical team had implemented Ryan's correction in 97 minutes, faster than he had estimated, which meant the team was good, which was something worth knowing. The attack vector had closed. The positioning that had been navigating Iran's air defense network interior had found itself suddenly walled in and had withdrawn. The digital equivalent of a hand finding a door that had been open an hour ago now sealed shut and retreating before the change could be detected and its cause understood. No breach. No data exfiltration. No operational disruption. The defense network had been compromised for 6 hours and 22 minutes, and nobody outside a very small room would ever know it. Tehrani did not say thank you on the call. He was not a man who operated in those terms. Not because he was ungrateful, but because gratitude between serious professionals was carried in action rather than language, and because what he was about to do in the next 72 hours was the most genuine expression of what he felt about what Ryan had done. What he said was, "The technical matter has been resolved. I wanted you to know." Ryan said, "Good." A pause. Then Tehrani said, in a register that was slightly different from his operational voice, quieter, more personal, "Rest well, Ryan." The call ended. Ryan set down his phone. He looked at the Tehran morning, beginning outside his window. He thought about what came next. Not with anxiety. He had not felt anxious since his 20s, had trained that particular response out of himself because anxiety consumed resources that analysis needed, but with the particular clarity of a man who understands that the next chapter has begun and is curious about its shape. The Security Council briefing happened at 10 o'clock that morning. Ryan was not present. He was in his apartment reading. But what happened in that room? What was said, what was not said, what landed in the silence between the sentences, would reach him by afternoon through channels that had nothing to do with official communication and everything to do with the informal architecture of an institution that had been processing his dismissal and its consequences simultaneously. General Tehrani presented the incident to the full Security Council. He was precise and complete. He presented the timeline, the detection at 4:26 in the afternoon, the technical team's engagement, the escalation at 6:17, the resolution at 11:14. He presented the technical details in the language of military briefings, the vulnerability, the attack vector, the correction. He presented the source of the correction. He did not editorialize. He did not express an opinion. He stated a fact. The corrective solution had been designed and delivered by Ryan Caldwell, former senior strategic advisor to the Supreme National Security Council, in his private capacity, within 2 hours of receiving the network topology. The room received this information. The council members who had been present for 6 years of Ryan's work received it with the particular expression of people who are not surprised but are registering, formally, the confirmation of something they already knew. The newer members, Rashidian's appointments, men who had arrived in the last 6 weeks carrying the new administration's certainties, received it with expressions that were harder to read but that contained, beneath their professional surfaces, the beginning of a recalibration. Hosseini, the chief of staff who had delivered the dismissal 27 hours earlier, sat at the end of the table and looked at the briefing summary in front of him and did not look up for a long time. The council chair, a cautious, precise man named Mousavi, who had survived 4 administrations by being indispensable to all of them, asked 2 questions. The first was technical, about the nature of the vulnerability. The second was not technical at all. The assessment that identified this vulnerability, when was it submitted to this council? Tehrani answered, February of the previous year. Mousavi looked at the table. And the recommended remediation? Partially implemented. 2 of 4 recommended corrections were applied. The remaining 2 were deprioritized during the transition period. The room was very quiet. Mousavi said, I see. He made a note. He moved to the next agenda item with the efficient professionalism of a man who understands that some silences need to be allowed to settle before they are named. The international dimension arrived by afternoon. 3 foreign intelligence services had detected the attack, had watched its penetration of Iran's air defense network, and had been preparing their own assessments of what the successful breach might mean for regional security dynamics. They had then watched the attack fail. They had watched a vulnerability that their own analysts had identified as significant and likely to be exploited be closed with a speed and precision that exceeded their estimates of Iran's defensive capability. The question that circulated through those three intelligence communities, in the careful language of services that never state things directly. Who did that? The answer surfaced through the back channels that answers surface through, slowly, partially, with the particular texture of information that is significant enough to travel but sensitive enough to travel quietly. In London and in Tel Aviv, and in a building in Langley, Virginia, an analyst wrote a name in a report. The report moved upward through its chain. In Langley, the report landed on the desk of a deputy director who had met Ryan Caldwell twice. Once at a conference in Geneva in 2018 and once at a back-channel meeting in 2021 that was not in anyone's official calendar. She read the report. She made a call to a colleague. She said, in the particular shorthand of people who understand the same things without needing to explain them, "He's available." The colleague said, "Not for long, I'd imagine." She said, "No, not for long." Rashidian received Tehrani's summary at 2 in the afternoon. He read it in his office, the same office from which he had authorized the dismissal the previous morning, surrounded by the particular authority of a man who had just assumed the most powerful position in his country and was now holding, in his hands, the first serious evidence of what that power had cost in its first 24 hours of exercise. The summary was 3 pages. He read all 3. He read them again. The vulnerability had been documented 14 months ago, by the man he had dismissed. The remediation had been recommended 14 months ago, by the man he had dismissed. The attack had come 11 hours after the dismissal. The fix had been designed in 2 hours, by the man he had dismissed. Rashidian was not a stupid man. He was an ideological man, which was a different thing, and the distinction had led him to a specific error, but he was not too proud, quite, to read arithmetic when the arithmetic was this clear. He set down the summary. He looked out the window at Tehran. He did not call anyone. Not yet. He sat with what he was holding. Some reckonings arrive loudly. Some arrive like this, in a quiet office, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, with the particular weight of a man who has made a significant mistake and is in the process of understanding its full dimensions. The man they dismissed in 11 minutes had solved in 2 hours what they could not solve in 6. That is not a coincidence. That is a record, and records cannot be reorganized. Please like and share this video, subscribe to Golden Triumphant Stories, and tell us in the comments, have you ever had your work speak so loudly that the people who dismissed you had nowhere left to look? General Tehrani came to Ryan's apartment on Saturday morning. Not a call, not a message through a masked number. He came in person, in civilian clothes, without aid or escort, in a car he drove himself, arriving at 8 o'clock with the directness of a man who had decided that some conversations required presence and that this was one of them. Ryan opened the door. He looked at Tehrani for a moment. He stepped back and let him in. They sat at Ryan's kitchen table. Ryan made tea, the Iranian blend, his father's recipe, the one he made every evening, and now made on a Saturday morning, because a man had come to his apartment and some things did not change with the clock. He set 2 cups on the table. They drank. Tehrani spoke first. He was 61 years old and had commanded armies and managed political relationships and navigated 4 decades of institutional life with the particular skill of a man who understood the difference between power and authority and had spent his career in the gap between them. He spoke now with the directness of someone who had earned the right to be direct and was using it. He told Ryan that the Security Council had completed its internal review of the Courland incident. Not the official name, but the one the council members had given it in the shorthand of people who needed to refer to something without quite naming it. He told him that the review had produced a recommendation. He told him that the recommendation had been presented to the Supreme Leader and had been accepted. Then he told him what the offer was. Senior Strategic Advisor to the Supreme National Security Council. Direct advisory relationship to the Supreme Leader. Full mandate to restructure Iran's integrated defense strategic framework from the ground up. Not to advise on existing structure, but to rebuild it, with the authority to identify vulnerabilities, recommend remediation, and follow those recommendations through implementation rather than leaving them for others to deprioritize during transition periods. More authority than he had held before. More access. More scope. Tehrani finished speaking. He picked up his tea. He waited. Ryan looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at Tehrani. "I have questions," he said. "I expected nothing less," Tehrani said. The questions took 40 minutes. They were specific, technical, and non-negotiable in the way that Ryan's questions always were. Not demands for assurance, but requirements for clarity, the kind of questions that a man asks when he needs to understand the actual structure of what is being offered rather than its surface. The scope of the mandate, the independence of the advisory function. Specifically, the requirement that his assessments be acknowledged in writing by the council, and that any decision to deprioritize a recommendation require a documented rationale signed by a named official. The terms of his dual citizenship, which he had no intention of surrendering, and which the new arrangement would need to accommodate. And 3 additional conditions that he had not discussed with anyone but had been formulating since Thursday morning, because he had known, with the particular knowledge of someone who understood how institutions work, that this conversation was coming. Tehrani answered each question completely. 2 of Ryan's additional conditions required him to make a call. He stepped away from the table, spoke quietly into his phone for 4 minutes, returned, and confirmed that the conditions were accepted. Ryan sat with the complete offer for a long moment. He thought about his father, who had built bridges and taught his son that the test of any structure was how it performed under load. He thought about his mother in Silver Spring, who had told him to do what he did, and had never told him what that was because she had known he already understood. He thought about 30 years of work, the accumulation of knowledge and judgment, and the particular discipline of a man who had chosen, again and again, to build things that mattered in spaces that were complicated and costly and necessary. He thought about 11 minutes, and what 11 minutes had cost the institution that had spent them. He said, "I'll need 72 hours." Tehrani nodded. He stood. He extended his hand. Ryan shook it, differently from the way he had shaken Hosseini's hand 4 days ago. This was a handshake between equals, between men who had worked alongside each other long enough to know what the other was made of. Tehrani left. Ryan cleared the cups. He stood at his window. He spent the 72 hours doing what he always did with decisions that mattered. He ran in the mornings, through the streets of Tehran that he had known since childhood, the particular geography of a city that was simultaneously ancient and immediate, that carried its history in its stones and its streets and the specific quality of its light at different hours. He ran without music, without phone, with only the city and his own thinking for company, because the best decisions he had ever made had been preceded by this kind of unhurried movement through familiar space. He cooked. He read. He sat with the question from multiple angles, not whether to accept, which he had known since Saturday morning, but how to accept on what terms, with what understanding of what the acceptance meant and what it required of him going forward. He had learned long ago that the terms on which you enter an arrangement shape everything that follows, and that the moment of negotiation, the moment before the signature, was the moment of maximum leverage and maximum clarity, and that it was worth using fully. He called his mother on Sunday evening. "They came back," she said. It was not a question. "They came back," he said. A long pause. He heard her exhale, the particular breath of a woman who has been holding something for 4 days and is now releasing it. "More than before?" she asked. "More than before." Another pause. Then, "What does your gut say?" He told her. She listened completely, the way she always had. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You know what I'm going to say," she said. "You're going to say do it completely or don't do it." "That's right," she said. "No halfway. That's not who you are." "I know, Mama." "And Ryan?" "Yeah. Make them put everything in writing this time." He laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that arrives unexpectedly and means exactly what it sounds like. "Already done," he said. She made a sound that was warm and satisfied and entirely her. "Good boy," she said, and she hung up. He accepted the position on Tuesday morning. He called Tehrani directly. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. He confirmed acceptance of all terms as negotiated. He specified his start date, 2 weeks hence, which he had calculated as the minimum time needed to properly close his civilian affairs, and the maximum time the institution could reasonably wait given what the previous week had demonstrated about what his absence cost. Tehrani said, "Good. We will be ready for you." Ryan said, "I know you will." He ended the call. He sat at his desk for a moment. Then he opened his laptop and began, not the threat assessment, not the transition documentation, not the administrative preparations for return. He opened a new file. He began writing the strategic framework proposal that the new mandate had been created to receive, the comprehensive restructuring of Iran's integrated defense strategic architecture that he had been formulating in theory for 3 years and could now build in practice. He had been waiting to write this document. He had known, for 3 years, what it needed to contain and had not had the authority to build it. He had that authority now. He was going to use it completely. He wrote for 6 hours. The Tehran afternoon became evening. The city lit up outside his window. He did not stop for the light. He walked back into the building on Pasteur Street on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after he had walked out of it. The same hallway, the same elevator, the same lobby with the 2 guards who had watched him leave and now watched him return. With different expressions this time, the particular expression of men who had understood something about what had happened in the days between and were registering it now in the only way their professional context permitted. A fractional straightening of posture, a slight deepening of the acknowledgement nod, the small language of people who cannot say what they mean but mean it precisely. He went to the 3rd floor. Not the conference room, his office. Newly assigned, larger than his previous one, with a window that faced north toward the mountains and a view of the city that he had not had before. He set his briefcase on the desk. He sat down. He looked at the view for a moment. Then he opened his laptop. Somewhere in the building, in an office he would never enter, RESIGN was beginning his 2nd month as supreme leader with a strategic advisor whose reinstatement he had authorized and whose conditions he had accepted, knowing, as he had not known 11 days ago, but knew now with the clarity that certain lessons provide, that excellence and loyalty were not the same thing, and that the attempt to substitute one for the other had cost his regime 11 hours and a lesson in arithmetic that he would not forget. Ryan did not think about RESIGN. He thought about the work, the framework document open on his screen, the 12 threat vectors, the structural corrections that needed building, the institution that needed, from its foundations up, the kind of strategic architecture that could hold under real load. He was 41 years old. He had 30 years of work behind him, and if the actuarial tables were cooperative, 30 more ahead. He had a mandate wider than anything he had held before, terms that protected his independence in writing, and a problem worth solving. He began to work. The mountains were visible through his north-facing window. Tehran spread below them, ancient, enormous, complicated, alive. The city that was half of who he was, doing what cities do, moving, building, trusting that the systems designed to protect it were in the hands of people who understood what protection required. They had forced him out in 11 minutes. It had taken 11 hours to understand what that cost. He was back. The work was waiting. And the record, the long, thorough, time-stamped, documented record that he had been building for 30 years with the particular care of a man who understood that excellence was not a moment, but an accumulation. The record had never gone anywhere at all. It had simply waited, the way all important things wait, for the people who dismissed it to finish being wrong. They forced him out in 11 minutes. It took 11 hours to understand what that cost. He didn't fight. He didn't beg. He sat down at his desk, opened his laptop, and did the work, because excellence doesn't resign. It waits, and it is always, eventually, irreplaceable. If this story moved you, share it right now with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Golden Triumphant Stories. And tell us in the comments, have you ever been called back by the people who let you go? What did that moment feel like? We want to know.